Well, welcome everybody. Gordon Stone here again. You can see my smiling face there on the screen if you're on the computer. If not, you might see a smiling face of both myself and Mark on a piece of paper if you've got it in front of you. Anyway, look, enough levity. Mark, welcome. Good to hear from you again. How are things?
Hi, Gordon. Hi. Well, thanks, Gordon. How's everyone? I hope we find everyone well tonight. It's not as cold as it has been, so at least where I am, so it's a bit of relief.
Good, thank you, Mark. And we've got Dave in the background who's managing things as always. So, folks, this evening we're going to do a couple of deviations from the norm if you've been regular attendees at our webinars. Tonight we're going to, rather than run through the 12 pillars, we've got a summarised view of the 12 pillars. So it's something a bit novel. The second thing is that Mark has actually created some worksheets because we found previously in our time management workshop that those are particularly useful. So Mark, the art of sales, is that important or not important from your point of view?
Well, from my point of view, being able to engage with your customers in a meaningful way is how we add value to relationships. And that is known in a business sense as being able to sell yourself, the product, and perhaps even the experience of doing business with you. So yeah, from my perspective, sales is one of the more important and certainly more interesting parts of doing business.
Great, quite agreed, Mark. So let's get going. For those of you who are regulars, you're well aware that this is actually part of our partnership arrangements with both Meat and Livestock Australia and the donor company, with a particular focus on the meat and livestock industry, AgForce in Queensland, and also the Queensland government. Effectively, it's part of a professional development process called the Agri-Business Management Program. And speaking of professional development, here's our new look summarised version of the 12 pillars of business best practice. If those of you who are familiar with the 12 pillars of business best practice, it's really logical that we think of this in quite a simplistic term. We only make money when we sell a product to a willing customer. Wouldn't it make sense to ensure the sales process and the product is highly efficient and effective and meets the customer's needs? The second thing is about positioning, and Mark's actually just given you a hint to that, because quite often it's our positioning in the marketplace. More to the point, it's the positioning of our business in terms of level of professionalism, in terms of robust management systems, and being sure that a high-performing business is the focus of our everyday life, particularly around working on the business. One of the other most important things for a high-performing business is to think about the processes that we use, and then also think about the people, because if people are using a systematic process, it helps our positioning and helps our income, and more particularly our profit, because we're efficient and effective. So speaking of what this is all about, let's just create a bit of context. If we're thinking of profitability of our business, it's quite critical to think about who is the customer. If we're getting some insights into the customer, in other words, rather than pushing a product out and hoping for the best, we're actually talking to our customer or engaging with our customer and asking them or engaging with them in such a way that we can pull the right product through to meet their needs. And of course, that means we have to have a clear understanding of who the customer is. And engaging with them in an efficient and effective way, when we understand what their wants and needs and drivers are, is effectively the marketing process, and ultimately it's the sales process, making the sale. So why wouldn't we be focusing on achieving the highest value? So Mark, anything to comment on around that context before we move on?
Yeah, I think you've described it really well, Gordon. The idea that sales and being able to sell is part of or one of those business skills that has to be invested in if you're going to move your business from being a commodity trading type arrangement to one where you're looking to add value. And it's one that's not often talked about or studied to any great deal, but it's any great level, but it's one of those ones that can really add a lot of value to what you're trying to do.
And Mark, just I'd add one more thing to that. Sales is something that is potentially a bit frightening to people. And I think it's important for them to understand that if you use the system that we'll discuss tonight and structure your sales process, it takes a lot of the fear out of it, and it increases your level of success.
Yeah, and part of it is it's an image thing, because there's connotations that go with the word, sales and selling that aren't always positive. They're it's been wrapped up in, so many different poor examples have been used to, when we think about sales, whether it be something to do with the automotive industry or something to do with the insurance industry. We're not kind of talking about that stuff tonight. That's not what it's about. When you think about sales in terms of its definition, I've got a little saying that I use, and that is that if the person you're talking to knew what you knew, would they still buy? And if, someone who teaches and coaches psychology around sales and in customer engagement, I've learned that if you can live by that mantra, then you're really pretty much always doing the right thing. And certainly what we teach at ABDI is that, we always want to be doing the right thing. The minute we're deceiving someone, we're on a very short road in terms of customer relationships. So that helps with some of the context, hopefully, about what we're gonna talk about tonight as well, Gordon.
Thanks, Mark. Let's get rolling. Really important that we just create some context for what this program is about. There's really three elements to what we do. Some people say, I'd like to get some coaching or mentoring in a particular aspect of business management, business structure. That's where the business coaching for the bush connection comes in, simply because it provides the opportunity for somebody who'd like to know more about, for example, sales and marketing or managing their finances, provides the opportunity for them to have one-on-one discussion, as well as access to this sort of material. And we find the one-on-one discussion is really most important and particularly valuable for those who want to fast track what they're doing. The second one is actually our 3-month intensive called the Agri-Business by Design, simply called that because we're looking for a designer type business. And this is about informing people about key business principles so they can be aware of the questions they need to ask. In other words, what they don't know, they don't know. And we actually take this message to people in regional locations. The Agribusiness Management Program over 12 months has some special face-to-face days, as well as providing information around those 12 pillars of business best practice. It's the one that's focused particularly on those people who say, I need to implement a change process. It's important for me to be self-accountable, and it's important for me to get an understanding of what I need to do differently and better with specialist input. So let's talk about the art of sales, because that's what you're on here for, to find out some information, but more particularly some of the subtleties. So we started to touch on why is sales important. The next thing that's important is to understand when we look into the customer's minds, they have to see some value or something specific or relevant to them that would make them do business with us, whatever that means. In lingo, that's called a value proposition. And fundamentally, that's all good in theory. It's important then to implement the sales process. So let's get started. So when we deal with the art of sales, and it's deliberately called an art because there are some people who are good at it and many people who could be good at it if they took the fear out of their thinking and decided that they were going to understand, enhance, and get education in the sales process. Fundamentally, it's about this concept of, rather than being or feeling that we're at the mercy of the market, that we actually give ourselves a positioning that we take an initiative. So Mark, could you expand on why and how around the art of sales?
Yeah, so thanks, Gordon. So when we talk about why, it comes back to what we want to achieve inside our own individual businesses and in our own markets. the why we're talking about here is the paradigm shift, the mind shift from being a price taker to being a price maker. And if you have that willingness to extract value out of what you're producing, you know, on a week-to-week, month-to-month, year-to-year basis, then the way to do that is to start learning about your customer, start learning about your market, and start learning about how you can present that information or present information about what you do in a way that's favourable and responds to what's happening in the market and in the lives of your customer. And that's really what selling is. Selling is kind of like an investigatory process first, and then it is a presentation process. So that kind of that's the why. If you want to move to a value add business and change from being a taker to a maker, then, you know, sales, and marketing generally, but sales specifically is a powerful tool to do that. So that's the why. When it comes to the how, well, what hopefully people are going to learn tonight, our audience is going to learn tonight, that it's not as scary, because just like just about everything else you do in business, there's actually a process that you can follow that really takes, first of all, the mystery out of it, and then improves your chances of being successful if you follow a process. Now, again, it comes back to the idea of it being an art. It's not a one, you know, process fits all type scenario. You've got to design your own process for your own market and your own customers. And so that takes skill. You've got to learn some skills on how to do that. And are you prepared to change as you learn about those skills, the way you do things? And the second thing is, how willing are you to execute? How much are you willing to do? Because if you're not prepared to change, once you learn these things, then you're probably going to stick to where you've always been, and you're probably going to get what you've always got. And so when we think about sales, the why and the how, it's about the motivation, and then it's about learning a process and then sticking to it. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So if we move on to, thanks Gordon, we've put up, I wanted to position sales in people's minds in terms of marketing. So overall, marketing is the idea that you're responding to a need in the market somewhere. And so sales is a part of marketing. It's a channel. It's a term we use. It's one of the channels that we use in marketing. And I wanted to incorporate this slide because it also talks to how marketing has changed and sales has changed in terms of that funnel. So if you think from the traditional perspective, so if we were going back, say, anything up to 20 or 30 years ago, where marketing and sales used to sit is positioned on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side on this slide, we've got how it's positioned now. And that's mostly because there's been the introduction of things like social media, electronic direct marketing, a whole range of additional tools that are now available that means sales doesn't get introduced until the very end of the funnel. Now, before we move on, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes on the different parts of a marketing funnel. So if you wanted to think about a brand, any brand, or if you're trying to establish a brand, and the brand could be you, it doesn't have to be, you know, the name of a product. People purchase in a system through a process, and first the thing they need to do is they need to become aware of the product or the service. The next thing they need to do is they then have to express interest in it. Once they've expressed interest in it, they move to the consideration phase. Will I or won't I? And then once they're in the consideration phase, they then move to intent. I'm intending to do something. So at that point, they might have one or two options that they're intending to buy. So they move into that evaluation. You know, is it black or red? And then at the very end of the funnel, you can see where they've decided to purchase. Now, what used to happen is that the sales thing that we're talking about tonight would start much earlier in the funnel. It would happen in consideration. These days, people are much happier to have the sales process introduced later in the funnel, in that evaluation phase. The reason being is that most of awareness, interest, consideration, and intent can be done on the internet, and people would prefer to do that before they start talking to a person. But nonetheless, that's a funnel, and it's a very powerful way of understanding where your product or service or your brand sits in terms of the relationship to a customer. And each customer will be at a different level. The other, again, one more thing before I move on, it works like a funnel. To get X amount of purchases at the bottom, you're going to need much more, a much larger number of people who are aware of your brand at the top, because people will fall out of the funnel as they move down the funnel for whatever reason. But it's a numbers game to a large extent. So that's where sales fits. It fits somewhere between consideration and purchase, depending on in the sales and marketing funnel, depending on what product and what market you're playing in. Any questions around that, Gordon?
No, look, I'm pretty good, Mark. I just want to reinforce that this is actually a system. There's a logical process, and it relates back to individual customers. And it may be that the sales process is built around you as an individual. So rather than worrying about, spending a lot of time and effort on brands and things, it may be important to understand that you or yours are the brand. So let's move on.
Okay.
So Mark, here we've talked about the money, because fundamentally what we're dealing with the sales process is we actually want to get someone to place an order so we can deliver against the order. And that might sound peculiar for people in agriculture or for other sectors, and yet it is that logical, that basically the funnel has demonstrated that somebody there actually wants to make a purchase, and then there's a final step in the process, which is, let's do this. So Mark, would you like to describe this whole interest fulfillment money side of things?
Okay, so the next two slides are going to describe contrasting ways of marketing and sales. The first one is probably more akin to what happens in most agricultural organisations or businesses. And I would describe that as being a business model that's focused on revenue rather than profit, particularly in the sales context. So what generally happens is that we would produce something. It is produced in response to interest. So a customer has an interest in buying whatever you're producing, your vegetables or your beef or whatever it is that you're doing. And then in terms of the marketing around that, that's more about just ringing up the agent and saying, I've got X amount of head ready to go to market. And then therefore the only thing that's negotiated in this type of business model is what I get paid for it and how many I've got. And then what's critical is that then you have fulfillment. So you have to deliver, you have to do the invoicing, everything has to work that you sell, it has to be what you promised, and there may be some other considerations around warranty and payment and administration. In a sense, this is an order-taking model where there is no sales happening in the process, even though we think, and we use terms like sales in livestock marketing or when we go to the sale yard, or when we go take our produce down to the markets. In a sense, it's not really marketing, it's bidding. It's not selling, it's bidding. And the way to describe this is that for this model, all you really need is a website and a warehouse, because it's a bidding system. There is no necessarily value in the people proposition around this type of revenue process. Now, I want to contrast that with what I would call the sales or the profit process. And to go back, we won't go back to the previous slide, but the only way that you can increase profit in the revenue model is that you need to reduce cost. That being if the sales price doesn't move. Whereas in this model, you're actually trying to find ways that you can lift the selling price. So what we introduce in this model is the idea of selling, and this is all about people. This is introducing the people in between the interest and the fulfillment. So how do you extract value from relationships? Well, first of all, you have to adopt what I call some key sales activities. That would mean that you would go and visit customers and potential customers, and you would talk to them about what their needs are. You would manage those clients in terms of regular contact, even when they're not buying, to see if any of their needs have changed. Internally, you would run sales meetings that would talk about customers' needs and what's happening on the production side of the business. You'd be running opportunity analysis and those sorts of things. They would be key sales activities that are formal, planned, and executed inside a sales organisation or an organisation that used this type of process. And then you also then have a very specific sales process when you meet with people. So the idea is that it may happen over time, it just hasn't happened in one meeting. There would have to be an introduction or an opening to the relationship. There would be a time spent where you're determining needs. You'd be presenting solutions. You'd be managing objections to any of those solutions. You'd have to pluck up the courage to ask for the order, and then you would follow up and start the whole process again. So the idea of maximising value in this process is understanding and meeting customer expectations. And what's in parentheses down there is known and unknown, and that becomes very important because you might actually help the customer or the potential customer discover needs they didn't even know they had. And when you do that, that's when you're starting to add value to the relationship. That's when you move from being a commodity based business to being one that's actually selling or adding value to your customer's business. Okay.
So thanks,
so
Mark.
Then we move. Okay.
So in summary, what we've looked at with this particular section is to understand that there is a real art and sales process. And so it's going to be important for us to understand the system and how it relates to us, to understand that there is potentially a degree of complexity or maybe a degree of simplicity in the process. So it's now time to move on to the second part of this discussion, which is around that word we used earlier, we called the value proposition. And the notion up here is it assumes that you know your customer intimately. So Mark, you've given us a couple of options here. It's called basic and differentiators. This is going to be fundamentally about understanding the customer. So can you just explain this concept?
It's about the customer. It's also about the attitude or what people may not understand about what is value. If you've come out of a commodity or a revenue-based business model, your mindset will be that you need to be competitively priced, you need to have the right products on hand at the right time, you need to have good product knowledge, you need to know a lot about what you're selling, and you need to be convenient to do business with, and you need to be efficient in how you run your business. Now, that customers do not see that as adding value. In fact, if you have that, you have to have those four things, otherwise you don't even have the right to play the game. So there's no value in being competitively priced, have the right products on the right hand, having great product knowledge, and being convenient and efficient in the way you do business, because just about everybody does that. There's no differentiation. When we think like that and operate like that, it tells us that our focus is on the product, not on the relationship. And to be able to sell effectively, you need to move what you think about from being about the product to being about what the customer wants. And that's the big shift. And when you get to do that, that's when you make yourself different to everyone else. And that's where you can extract value. So some of the things that I talk about here may not seem that earth-shattering, but it's surprising how much doesn't happen. So the idea of being proactive in terms of service, not waiting for opportunities to occur, but actually going out there and creating opportunities, talking to customers or potential customers when they're not ready to buy, is proactive in terms of the service that you offer. Recognizing and actually rewarding loyalty. Customers and potential customers like that idea. The idea that we have loyalty cards in the retail industry is a reflection of how important loyalty is to customers. They like the idea that they'll be rewarded for being loyal. The transition from having product knowledge to having not only product knowledge, but business knowledge. How much do I know the industry? How much do I know the customer's business? Even today I was working with a client on behalf of a client actually, and making some appointments and setting up some meetings. And the idea that we could talk to those people about their business and what they are looking to do, impress them enough to actually allow us to have an appointment to come and see them. So not just having product knowledge, but having business knowledge can be a real differentiator. Just being friendly, not seeing the customer as a competitor is surprising in terms of how much it makes a difference to developing relationships. Can we work together to solve or appreciate a particular problem rather than complaining about who's getting the biggest slice of the pie? Making sure that you are exposing your customers to opportunities. So if you learn of something that could help them grow their business, share it with them, and they will see value in that. They'll want to invest in that relationship, and there's many more that we could talk about in terms of being differentiators. But the key thing here on this slide is moving your focus from product to customer, from product to relationships. Just about every primary producer I talk to says to me in our first meeting, I've got the best whatever. And I nod nice and I say, yeah, you probably do. But gee, there's a lot of bests out there. That's not going to be the thing that's going to make a difference. It's the relationships that you can develop with potential business partners or customers that are going to make the business sustainable. So okay, that's the value in that slide.
Okay, and I wanted to summarise before we've moved on that this notion of a value proposition is actually about putting a proposition to a customer that they may know objectively or unconsciously, or we might position it consciously or unconsciously in their mind to help demonstrate the level of value that we bring to the equation with them. So Mark, this next slide deals with a range of somewhat complex issues. So could you just take us through this quite rapidly, just in terms of helping us think about the decisions that customers might make around a range of things that we may think about and maybe not even think about?
Yep. So again, because we're moving away from focus on product to focus on customer and their needs, we're able to actually understand how they make decisions. What is their decision-making criteria? So we can describe this in basically three key groups. If we can discover what are the business issues that a customer has, they might be growth, risk, time, competitors, profitability. If we can understand those things, we can then determine their needs. So the needs are about the product or the type of product that we might have that would solve or help them address those business issues. And then the third part of it is then we can move to understanding what their decision criteria is. So are they more interested in having a reliable product, working with someone who's got a great reputation or supporting their reputation? Is it going to be the technical support, and so on as we go down the list? But the line down the bottom of this slide is kind of the thing I wanted to emphasize. To create effective business relationships, you need to first understand their issues. So you can't talk about your product, you're talking about them, okay? What are their issues? Once you understand their issues, you understand what needs they have, and once you understand their needs, you get to understand what drives their decision making. What is the criteria that they pass things through to actually help them make a decision? This is the sales process. This is an important part of the sales process.
Okay, let's move along. So we've actually summarized the notion of that fancy term, the value proposition. Essentially, it's getting an insight into customers' minds. It's understanding what motivates them, or maybe what doesn't motivate them. It's about positioning us in that sales funnel to become clear and to be someone different from the other hundreds or thousands or 5 or 10s of other bests. So we've put the proposition forward that there ought to be a process, and if you can follow the process, it takes the fuss and bother out of it. So let's get started on the sales process. Again, a somewhat complex diagram, and yet it's relatively simple if we look at it from the point of view of being a process that is orderly and systematic. So Mark, would you just like to make sense of these arrows and the terms?
Okay, so we did refer to this earlier in the presentation when we talked about moving from a revenue-based business model to a profit-focused business model. And therefore, we wanted to introduce the idea that there's a map that you can follow. And like every good map, if you take a shortcut, there's a chance that you're going to end up in the wrong place. You're not going to extract all the experience that you possibly could, or the value that you could out of a particular relationship. So we've mapped it out in this circle. So I'm going to run through it in terms of it being a meeting with a customer, but it doesn't have to be a meeting. It could be a series of meetings. It could be a series of communications that could be described in each of these particular steps. So, but I'm going to talk about it in terms of a meeting. So if you went to see a prospective customer or an existing customer with the idea that you want to understand what their business issues are, okay, what you would do is you'd have an opening. Now, when we say opening, we're not talking about, you know, the weather's dry or whatever those how you going type conversations. What we're talking about an opening here is that we're expressively saying what the reason is for the meeting. This is why we're here. Then we move to what we call the determining needs part of it. So you need to learn a skill on how to transition from stating the reason for the meeting, the purpose of the meeting, to determining needs. And so determining needs is all about asking questions. And we're going to talk a little bit later on. I'm going to introduce a tool that helps you map out that conversation. So you spend time determining needs. Once you determine the needs and you've gone through that decision-making criteria process, you've then earned the right to offer some solutions or options. And you would put them on, you'd share them with the customer. Now, they're not the offer, right? You're not asking for the order. You're just throwing up some opportunities or options on how you might meet some of those needs. The customer is going to have some objections around that, and you've got to learn the skill of managing those objections. Some people call it negotiation, but the idea of that you're going to be prepared because you've understood the customer's needs to be able to help them manage those objections. Then you've got to ask for the order. So, do you want it delivered on Tuesday or Thursday? Do you want a black one or a red one? At some point in time, you've got to ask, can we actually do business? And then after you do that, you follow up, which is takes a lot of courage, because if you've executed on the deal, you've supplied what they wanted to, ringing them up 2 days later and say, did that delivery go well, can take a lot of courage. But when you do that, it continues to build the relationship, and then we're back to the opening and we're on the next sales opportunity. Now, I've got one little line down the bottom there. I don't care whether you're selling a house over 8 months or whether you're selling a pack of chewing gum at the newsagents. Every sale follows that process. Every time it follows that process. So if you can learn where you are in the sales process, if you can learn, am I still at the determining needs part of it? Because until you've got all those needs out, you don't have the right to move on to solutions. And until you've put your solutions on the table, you've got no right to ask for the order. So by mapping it out, and like I said, I've got a diagram a little bit later, some tools a bit later on the presentation that would help someone plan this out. But that's the map of how sales occurs.
So Mark, before we move on, just a couple of really quick observations. One is the determining needs phase is something that people often neglect, and yet that's an opportunity to demonstrate or to build common ground and demonstrate understanding and of the needs of the customer. And the follow-up process may well be daunting, and yet isn't it better to know that there's a problem sooner rather than later, rather than much later down the track when you discover that somebody else has come in over the top of you and acquired that relationship.
That's right. And you know, when we're a product-focused business rather than a relationship-focused business, we very quickly move from opening to solutions and options. And we just completely skip that middle section.
Okay, so the next thing that we promised, Mark, was to give people an understanding of some of the skills that sit behind that roadmap. Yep. So understanding the message being delivered into the marketplace and understanding that different circumstances require an adjustment to the roadmap, and that at the end of the day, having the conversation and actually doing the deal is an important element of the process. So I'll hand back to you.
All right, so we're not going to have time tonight to talk about what these skills are, but these are the skills that you need to learn if you're going to move from a commodity type, trading type arrangement to where you're adding value. The first thing you need to do, you need to have industry and market knowledge and product knowledge, which most people already have, and you need to understand the messaging. So you need to learn how to articulate the value, deliver what we call an elevator pitch, which positions your business on your product offering versus the competitors, and you need to be able to put that in the big picture, explaining the big picture. So having industry and product knowledge and learning the messaging skills that you need is a critical skill to have. The second thing is the ability to handle specific situations. As much as we talked about being a process, the idea that you develop the skills around how to prospect, so how do I find people who want to buy what I sell? How do I negotiate? How do I navigate the relationship? How do I identify decision makers? And then how to identify people who are actually going to want to buy. They're all skills that people who adopt a value-add model need to learn. The last thing is you need to develop your own specific sales process. While I've given you a map, each sales process is different based on the market, the people involved, the relationships that exist. So mapping out a sales process that's specific to your business is critical, and also then delivering the idea of executing it, sticking to the plan is a skill that you need to learn to do if you're going to be successful in using sales to add profit to your business.
So let's move on, Mark. We promised people a couple of tools. Shall we open up these tools and ask you to run through them?
Yeah, let's do that.
So here we have what's called a call plan, Mark. And
that's right.
I often describe a call plan as certainly being important for sales, but it's actually a very important process to engage with people for a range of topics. But I'll let you manage it around the sales process.
Yeah, so a call plan is basically an interview or a meeting map that you write before you have the meeting. So the idea is that you want to plan and record the things that you're going to talk about. So apart from the basic contact information at the top, the idea that you've identified what are the opportunities that might exist between you and the other party. What is the purpose from the customer's perspective or the prospective customer's perspective of the meeting? What is it that they want to learn? Now, if you can't satisfy that, then you're not going to have a relationship, because they must come first. You must walk out of that meeting knowing that they got what they wanted from the meeting. Then what's your call objective? What do you want out of the meeting? And I encourage people to write that down. Then, if we can scroll down just a little bit, Gordon, then it's a case of mapping out the questions that you're gonna ask. And I'll just run through it quickly. General questions are questions like, how's things going? Are you finding, what's the biggest issue that you've got in your business right now? What's the biggest challenge you've got? I noticed that you're doing this, how's that going? And when people respond to that, they're going to give you some ideas on what those challenges are. Then you identify each of those key issues and you ask some questions around them. They're called channeling questions. It's really important that when you discover these needs right now, you do not offer solutions, because like we talked about earlier, you don't have the right to do that. Then we talk about both buyer impact questions and buyer benefit questions. So because you're using the wrong fertilizer this year, what impact has that had on your business? And he would describe that, or she would describe that. And then the benefit question would be, well, if you were using the right product, what do you think the benefits would be? And then you did confirm the buyer needs, and then we move through the rest of the, you can offer your solution and you can agree to some next steps. But what we're talking about here is that you map out and you pre-prepare for that meeting, and you've spent some time investing in what type of questions and specifically what you're trying to get out of the meeting. So that's like the meeting plan. And then if we can bring the other one up, Gordon, the other document. So this is a customer needs analysis. So once we've planned out the meeting, we need to record the things that we've learned. Now you can do both of these things in a notebook. I've just got some forms that can help. But the idea that you've identified the key business issues, you've listened to what they've said and identified some product categories or some services that you offer that might potentially solve those particular issues. Who's the right person to talk to around having an ongoing conversation around those? And if you scroll down a little bit more, Gordon, you can see, you can start to learn about the overall business and what the description of that business is and what the issues are. And if you keep scrolling down, you can see where we move on to some things that we can do and then agree to some actions down the bottom. And that's just a way of recording what happens in that initial meeting. The summary of those documents is that this stuff needs to be recorded, because it can take 3 to 6 months to build an effective business relationship, and capturing this data, this information is really important, because you can refer to it further down the track.
And I think, Mark, that's actually the beauty of the discussion that we're having around the system, that this is part of the system. And once you've got a longer term system that gains an appreciation of needs, wants, drivers, and that sort of thing that may even change over time, it gives you greater insight.
And we did say that if anyone wanted to get a copy of these documents, we're happy to send them out to you. If you wanted to look at them at your own leisure, happy to do that.
Okay, so in summary, Mark, thank you for your time. And if anyone wants to think about questions, this is the opportunity for them to do so. So what we've done with this third section of the sales process is actually brought some particular sales tools to bear, which it's important to understand they are actually a system, which means that they can be customized. And if you're going to customize the system, it's about understanding in much more detail the needs and wants and drivers of the customer. And it may be somebody who is a processor of some sort. It may actually be a wholesaler or a retailer. So it's about identifying the customer and those requirements, and then using your system or that system as a means of bringing order and structure and creating a longer term database, we'll call it, of wants, needs and drivers that we can refer back to over time. So Mark, in summary, is there anything about that third matter that we need to raise before we draw things to a close?
Just the effectiveness of it, Gordon. I mean, you and I have both had experiences where we've taken clients to existing customers, whether it be a large supermarket or a processor, and adopted that way of interviewing and exploring business needs with that customer. And our client has walked out of that meeting and learnt things that they never knew were an issue to their customer, and provided them with opportunities to add value and indeed improve the profitability of their own business based on a greater understanding of their customers' needs. That's what I'd say, that this works. This type of system actually works when you put it into practice. So
once again, it's all about the system. Hence, people accessing the document if they'd like it, or those two documents, which we're quite willing to share to help people on their sales journey. So in summary then, we'll open it up for questions in a minute. If anyone's interested in finding out about more of these matters, exploring them any further, we've already indicated that we run a number of programs. We've already indicated that you can have a chat with us about any of these matters, and there's an email address and a telephone number. So they're more than happy to have a conversation with anybody about those matters. So Dave, are there any questions that people have in the background that we need to address?
G'day everyone. It seems a bit quiet on the question front, but if you do have any, feel free to type them into the question bar, or just send them through to us afterwards and we can address them afterwards.
Sure, thanks Dave. And as always, we're more than happy to take questions out of session, because quite often that does happen. People reflect upon these points. And when you close off your webinar, there'll be a quiz, for want of a better term, which will actually allow you to give us a bit of feedback, which we're more than happy to take. So if no further questions, Dave, nothing at this stage?
Not at this stage.
Okay. Thank you all for attending. We hope this has been useful and relevant to you, because sales and marketing are one of the unseen areas, along with money management, that people often feel fearful of or frustrated with. And this is our intent, to set up a system that might be useful and relevant to everyone. So thank you all for attending. We'll now close, and let's look forward to speaking with you soon in the next few weeks when we have our next webinar. Bye for now.